Hello and welcome to the 73rd edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's pod is titled The Carbon Cost of the Summer Travel Season. Europe's summer rush is arriving with a fuel warning, a carbon bill, and a queue at the gate. The immediate pressure is jet fuel supply, with International Air Travellers Association warning that European flights could face cancellations if tightness gets worse. The deeper system problem is harder to avoid. Aviation still wants growth on an oil-based model, while airports, airlines, regulators, and passengers are finally being dragged into the cost of that choice. The seasonal mood around aviation is usually simple enough. Families want holidays, airlines want full aircraft, airports want packed terminals, governments want tourism to spend, business travel and growth headlines. Nobody running a route network wants to become the official voice of delayed boarding and higher fares. But summer 2026 has turned the industry's dependence on jet fuel into a live commercial risk. The disruption around the Strait of Hormuz has forced traders, refiners, and airlines to redraw supply routes, with Europe especially exposed because it imports such a large share of its jet fuel. Aviation has very little slack in the wrong places. You can reschedule staff, lease aircraft, shift slots, and annoy passengers with app notifications. You can't run a long-haul flight on good intentions and a sustainability page in the annual report. The fuel problem is the cleanest opening into the wider aviation climate problem. Aircraft still run overwhelmingly on kerosene. Demand is recovering, travel growth remains strong, airports are still pushing capacity expansion, and the decarbonisation tools are arriving slowly, expensively, and unevenly. For us at Synergy International, this is where the airport debate becomes more serious than the usual fight between growth slogans and climate slogans. Aviation infrastructure is physical, long-lived and capital-hungry. A runway lasts for decades. A terminal expansion reshapes demand. A hub airport pulls in new routes, freight flows, staff commuting, taxis, hotel nights, diesel backup, catering logistics, and fuel infrastructure. Once that system is built, it does what it was built to do. It grows. That is why the environmental impact of airports needs more attention. Most public debate focuses on airlines, aircraft, and passengers. Fair enough. The aircraft burns the fuel, the airline sells the ticket, the passenger takes the trip. Airports create the platform. They are the choke points, growth engines, and local pollution sources wrapped into one asset class. They shape how much flying can happen, where it happens, and how aggressively airlines can build traffic. The latest airport tracker work gives us a useful set of numbers. Across 1,300 of the world's busiest airports, the tracker counted 35 million flights and 1,026 million tons of CO2 in 2023, the latest annual figures now available. Asia Pacific accounted for 32% of those airport-linked emissions, North America 27%, and Europe 24%. That is not background noise. If aviation were treated like a country, those airport-linked emissions would place it among the biggest emitters in the world. Airports look like terminals from the passenger side. From the climate side, they look like concentrated emissions machines. The concentration is sharp. The 20 highest emitting airports produce 280 million tons of CO2, more than 27% of overall airport emissions. 18 of those top 20 were in high-income countries. The top 5 make the point in plain numbers. Dubai produced 23 million tons of CO2. London Heathrow produced 21 million. Los Angeles produced 19 million. Seoul Incheon and New York JFK each produced 17 million. Those rounded numbers should change how we talk about airports. Heathrow is a national infrastructure asset, a jobs machine, and a strategic gateway. It is also one of the largest airport-linked carbon sources on Earth. Both realities sit in the same departure lounge. That is the uncomfortable part for the UK. London is not a side character in this story. London's airports also produced more than 9,500 tonnes of NOx from landing and takeoff activity, alongside more than 5,900 tonnes of carbon monoxide. The environmental issue is not tucked away neatly in global carbon accounting. It sits around flight paths, access roads, airport jobs, local air quality, noise contours, and homes under the approach path. This is where UK politics has tied itself into a very British knot. Everyone wants growth and yet somehow lower emissions. Everyone wants better regional connectivity and cheaper holidays. Yet everyone also wants the Treasury to find tax receipts somewhere without discussing any carbon pollution. Heathrow's third runway debate has come back into the machinery of the airport's national policy statement. Luton has won approval for expansion. Gatwick has been through its own runway process. Around London, airport capacity has become a test of whether the UK can talk honestly about infrastructure trade-offs without turning every hard decision into a slogan duel. Airport expansion needs tougher tests on carbon, fuel security, and local pollution. Expansion can't be waved through on jobs, growth, and future fuel assumptions, while the carbon accounting is pushed into another room with a spreadsheet and a nervous junior official. The issue is timing. Aviation is leaning heavily on sustainable aviation fuel, newer aircraft, operational efficiency, carbon pricing, and offsets. Those tools all have a part to play. None of them currently support the level of growth being sold politically. Sustainable aviation fuel, known as SAF, is the easiest example. The EU's Refuel EU aviation rules currently require a 2% SAF share at EU airports, rising to 70% by 2050. Those targets are serious, and many say unrealistic. They also run straight into supply reality. IATA expects SAF production of 2.4 million tonnes this year. That is less than 1% of total jet fuel consumption. So yes, SAF is necessary. It is also scarce, expensive, and contested. In Europe, that premium lands inside a sector already dealing with fuel price volatility, carbon pricing, labour costs, fleet investment, and route competition. The story sounds green in policy language. In airline finance, it sounds like margin pressure. Carbon pricing is the next pressure point. The EU emissions trading system already covers aviation within Europe, and free allowances are being phased out with full auctioning this year for flights within the European Economic Area. Brussels is now assessing whether its carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation, known as CORSIA, is strong enough. If it is not, the EU could extend emissions trading system coverage to departing flights. That would pull long-haul exposure into a much harder carbon price. The commercial implications are large enough to make airline boards sit upright. Transition metrics projections suggest that Lufthansa could face €1.8 billion in additional 2027 costs if the EU extends carbon pricing to departing flights. IAG could face €1.7 billion. Air France-KLM could face €1.5 billion. Those would be big hits, not decorative sustainability numbers. If a Frankfurt-Beijing ticket needs another €100 to cover carbon costs, somebody must absorb it, be it the passenger, the airline, the corporate travel budget, or the route network. That is why airlines are fighting so hard. Air France-KLM has opposed an ETS extension to departing flights, arguing it would weaken competitiveness against non-EU carriers and risk retaliation from third countries. Airlines for Europe wants the EU to focus on strengthening CORSIA instead. There is a geopolitical memory here. When the EU last tried to extend aviation emissions, trading more aggressively in 2012, the US and China pushed back hard. Washington even moved to shield US airlines. Aviation has always had this strange diplomatic immunity around climate policy, as though the atmosphere politely checks route rights before warming. CORSIA sits at the centre of the argument. The International Civil Aviation Organization says 130 states participate, and the scheme is voluntary through the first phase ending this year. It requires airlines to offset emissions growth above a baseline on covered international routes. The weakness is obvious. Offset schemes depend on coverage, quality, enforcement, and political will. When large emitters sit outside, or when the scheme touches only a limited slice of emissions growth, the climate signal gets soft. The EU's tougher approach is unpopular because it creates a real price. That is the point of a carbon market. It turns emissions into cost and forces the boardroom to argue over aircraft utilisation, fleet renewal, fares, long-haul growth, SAF procurement, and route profitability. For us at SYNI International, that is where the aviation debate becomes commercially honest. Climate policy works only when it changes incentives. If a policy leaves everyone's growth plan, route network, and balance sheet untouched, it is probably too polite to do much. Airports sit in the middle of this. Many airport climate plans focus on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, terminal energy efficiency, electric ground vehicles, renewable electricity procurement, cleaner heating, better building standards, all useful work. The aircraft fuel burn usually dominates the climate impact, and that sits in broader definition of Scope 3. The Airport Tracker Brief says Scope 1 and 2 usually make up less than 10% of an airport's total climate impact, while Scope 3 emissions from aircraft burning fuel make up the bulk. This is where airport sustainability can become a little too convenient. Put solar panels on the terminal roof, electrify baggage tugs, buy renewable power, and the brochure starts looking tidy. Meanwhile, the real emissions are climbing out from jets on runways. That does not mean terminal decarbonisation is fake. It means it is incomplete. Airports should electrify ground operations, improve building performance, cut diesel backup, provide fixed electrical ground power, and reduce local pollution. But the runway is the business model. Any airport climate plan that avoids traffic growth and aircraft fuel burn is leaving the main invoice unopened. The mild, practical position is that airport expansion should pass a full system test before it is approved. The test should include aircraft emissions, local air pollution, noise, grid capacity, SAF availability, road and rail access, carbon price exposure, resilience to fuel disruption, and the credibility of demand forecasts. Aviation demand forecasts can look very smooth until reality drops a spanner into the engine. Pandemic restrictions, airspace closures, fuel price shocks, geopolitical conflict, labour shortages, aircraft delivery delays, engine problems, and consumer weakness have all hit the sector in recent years. And still, the growth story keeps returning. IATA expects global passenger demand to more than double by 2050 in its mid-range scenario to 20.8 trillion in 2050. That is a huge expansion in activity. The industry's bet is that efficiency, SAF, better operations, carbon markets, and future technology can pull emissions down while demand rises. That is a hard bet. It may work better in some regions than others, and better on short haul than long haul. It certainly needs more than upbeat slide decks from airports promising net zero while fighting for more slots. Europe and the UK have a particular problem because they want aviation growth and climate credibility at the same time. They also want industrial competitiveness, tourism, trade links, hub status, and lower household costs. Political leaders keep hoping those goals can be stacked neatly without one crushing the others. Markets are less sentimental. If carbon pricing expands, airlines with large long-haul exposure will face higher compliance costs. If SAF remains scarce, mandates will raise procurement costs. If jet fuel supply stays volatile, fares rise or schedules tighten. If airports expand without stronger rail access and air quality controls, local opposition hardens. And if governments pretend all of this can be solved by future technology alone, lenders and investors will start adding their own risk premiums. Capital dislikes climate ambiguity when that ambiguity might land inside planning permission, carbon costs, legal challenge, community consent, or fuel supply. That is why lazy arguments on airport expansions fail on both sides. Saying, build it because growth is too thin. Saying, block it because aviation is too blunt. The right test is harder. Does the expansion fit inside a credible aviation carbon pathway? Are the carbon costs priced? Is rail access good enough? Is SAF supply real enough? Are local air quality and noise conditions enforceable? Who carries the capex? Who carries the planning risk? Who pays if the demand assumptions are wrong? The same logic applies all across Europe. Schiphol has become a live example of environmental limits and flight caps. Barcelona expansion has faced opposition around climate, public health, and regional impacts. Paris, Charles de Gaulle, Frankfurt, and Amsterdam all sit inside the top 20 airport emissions list. These hubs are economic assets and environmental pressure points at the same time. Dubai, Los Angeles, Incheon, and JFK then give us the global comparison. Dubai shows what a fast-growing long-haul hub means in carbon terms. Los Angeles shows the scale of US airport-linked emissions, especially in a country where domestic aviation, freight, and private jets are deeply embedded. Incheon shows the role of Asia-Pacific hubs in a region where travel demand has enormous room to grow. JFK shows how a single airport can sit inside a much larger citywide aviation footprint. The global airport map is really a map of wealth, connectivity, and oil dependence. High-income countries dominate the current emissions. Growth markets are catching up. Airports everywhere sell capacity as prosperity, and prosperity still arrives with kerosene attached. The fairness cut should be short because it can easily become preachy. But it belongs near the end. Flying is not evenly distributed. Previous research by Stefan Gössling and Andreas Humper found that only 2% to 4% of the global population flew internationally a decade ago, while 1% of the world's population produced around half of commercial aviation, CO2. More recent information on private aviation sharpens the point. A 2024 Nature paper found private aviation produced at least 15.6 million tonnes of CO2, and almost half of private flights were shorter than 500 kilometres. Some of those trips are effectively taxis with wings. Only the meter is climate damage, and the tip is paid by everyone else. That does not mean ordinary summer holiday makers should be treated as the villain of the piece. Most people flying once a year are not the core driver of aviation's structural problem. The bigger pressure sits with frequent flyers, premium cabins, corporate travel habits, private jets, long-haul growth, airport expansion, and a policy system that still underprices the climate cost of flying. A fair aviation policy should start there. It should price emissions more honestly, tighten rules around private aviation, push corporate travel budgets toward lower carbon choices where alternatives exist, strengthen rail substitution on short routes, and require airports to account properly for Scope 3 emissions when asking to expand. That would still leave aviation with an expansive future. It would also make that future more honest. Aviation does things other sectors can't easily replace. A long list starting with long-distance connectivity, family links, emergency travel, cargo, tourism, diplomacy, specialist labour mobility, and economic integration. The coming summer puts all of this into one messy picture. Fuel supply is tight. Fares are sensitive. Airlines are watching carbon prices. Airports want capacity. Governments need growth. Passengers want holidays. Climate targets keep sitting in the background like an unpaid invoice with red lettering. For us at Synergy International, the strategic tension is clear. Aviation cannot keep asking for growth while treating climate policy as an irritant, fuel security as somebody else's problem, and airport expansion as a local planning question. The sector is entering a phase where carbon, fuel, finance, and infrastructure all meet at the same gate. The winners will be the airlines, airports, and governments that treat those pressures as commercial facts early, with more honest expansion tests. Aviation has always sold freedom. Summer travel sells it best. Beaches, family, cities, weddings, conferences, football tournaments, school holidays, and the sheer joy of getting somewhere else. That freedom has a carbon cost, a fuel security cost, and a local pollution cost. The mature industry response is to price those costs, reduce them where possible, and stop pretending expansion can float above physics. Runways are not abstract growth symbols. They are concrete, kerosene, noise, jobs, freight, capex, carbon, planning law, and neighbourhood politics. They deserve serious treatment because they shape emissions for decades. Well, that's a wrap on our 73rd GreenWave podcast episode. Thank you for sharing your attention with us. You can find the GreenWave podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Podbean, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. Follow the show, share the episodes with friends and colleagues, and leave us a 5-star review if you enjoy the work we are doing. You can also follow Synergy International on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, or visit us directly at synergy-international.net. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.